So Moses, it's your turn.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Gina and CoCreate Humanity, for hosting me on this very important topic. You may allow me for now share my screen, and then we start to dive into this very important discussion. You help me confirm if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Sorry.
Excellent.
But
Okay,
we don't see the slide. We see all the.
Yeah, it will come.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So welcome all of you who are currently watching or participating in this very important webinar, where we are going to speak about the concept of suicides. I am Moses Mukasa Bwesige, and I'm an HPS specialist, a suicide doctorate researcher at the University of Ghent in Belgium and at Makerere University in Uganda. For over 10 years, I've been involved in actions to prevent and respond to suicides in low and middle income countries. Part of the work I've done has seen development of research and evidence-based interventions and actions to prevent suicide, mostly in humanitarian settings. In today's session, we are going to focus on a few items that will inform the entire discussion. Understanding suicide. We shall talk about suicide as an everyday changing terminology. What can we do? And then we shall open this conversation to questions and answers. I'm glad you're here, and I'm so thrilled that you've spared your time to engage with us in both a very sensitive but also emotional topic at personal, community, and societal levels. In this conversation, just to put a few caveats, I will not be able to give you answers or to give you treatment if in case you have difficulties with your emotions. I won't be able to give you treatment throughout the conversation. However, I will suggest that in case any of the topics identifies with how you feel and your current emotional well-being, you seek professional advice and support. In our session 2, we shall look at how do we promote mental wellness in all our areas of work, also in our communities. We shall talk about coping mechanisms, adaptive and maladaptive, so that we're able to discern what is good for us as human beings and as people who interact within an equal social system. Thanks to CoCreate Humanity for inviting me. We've all, in our everyday life, heard the use of the word suicide. We use it passively, jokingly, on the bus, on the tram, even on flights. We use it while interacting with each other, but we really never know exactly what this means. Essentially, the term suicide refers to all actions carried out by an individual or a group of individuals with the intent of taking their own lives. So this does not mean the way we use suicide, the concept of suicide is right. Sometimes you hear people say, I want to die because they are very excited, or because they are drinking too much beer, or because they are having a cake on a party. But this is a different way of using the concept of suicide from exactly what we are going to discuss today. We are talking about a situation where an individual makes a decision rationally or irrationally to end their own life. Two most important concepts for us to be aware of is what we call suicide ideations or thoughts of ending one's life. We cannot have the word suicide without suicide ideation, which is always the first phase of a person to experience the desire to end their own life. Ideations are thoughts. They can be passive, meaning they can be wishes. They can be active, meaning they can be intentional and directed towards ending one's life. We shall also use mostly in this conversation the word suicidal attempt, which the Center for Disease Control in the United States defines as the non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of that behavior. And in the use of this concept or term, there's something I want you to pay attention to, which is agency, self-initiated. Suicidal attempt, which is the act itself, has a sense of agency, which means an individual has to initiate it by himself, psychologically, and also in terms of actions. Non-zero intent. When people are attempting or involved in suicide behaviors, they have both two ideations. They want to die or not to die. So sometimes they don't intend to take their own lives, but they end up dying from suicide. So it's non-zero, there's non-zero intent in suicide enactment or attempts. As I mentioned, that we should also touch about the concept of coping mechanisms, so which is a response. So coping mechanisms are always a response of a set of actions or thought processes used in a stressful environment. When people are stressed, they either respond positively or negatively. Sometimes technically, people say adaptive or maladaptive coping mechanisms. Shall see that in details. Now, why this subject and webinar is very important, thanks to CoCreate Humanity and colleagues all over the world who have supported us to have this conversation today. And I'll repeat, this topic is of global concern. It's not a topic for CoCreate Humanity. CoCreate Humanity is just expressing concern to such a global phenomenon. Globally, in some literature, you find documented 800,000 people dying every year from suicide. Sometimes you read some reports from WHO indicating 700,000 people dying every year, which means that more people die from suicide than war and any other condition. It is one of the priority actions that has been highlighted by the United Nations through its Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, it has a clear goal with the target 3.4 that talks about preventing deaths. How about who is at risk of suicide globally? I can tell you two things. All of us can be susceptible to suicide depending on the conditions and circumstances we are in. But highlight more of the most at-risk populations. We have the refugees, we have the LGBT communities, we have children between the age of 15 to 25. We have people who are living under dire life circumstances and ever-changing circumstances. We can all be victims of suicide, regardless of whether we are in middle or developed countries, regardless of whether we are married, single, rich, poor, regardless of whether we have good mental health or bad mental health, regardless of whether we have good, complete health or we are living with specific conditions. That makes suicide a global area of concern that needs to be talked about. Going back to statistics, if you have close to 800,000 people dying from suicide every year, it means for every 40 seconds that we've spent talking here, one person has died from suicide, sadly, including young people of all age groups, between the age of 15, the age of 25 and above. Evidence shows that for every suicide enactment, there are 20 people thinking about the same. This makes the topic of global concern. I would love to talk through to help you and myself understand the dynamics of suicide. In many literature, in many conversations, suicide is treated as a very complex phenomenon. Indeed, it is very complex. In this session, I will help you find a differing line to understand the psychological dynamics of suicide. One of the most famous explanatory theories of suicide that has surpassed doubts in explaining suicide is what we call the integrated motivation model, advanced by O'Connor. I'll use this to help you understand basically how does suicide happen, where you are, within your friends, colleagues, and people of concern all over the world. The 700,000 people I've talked about. When you understand this, you'll be able to help those who are at risk, friends, family members, and communities. I'll tell you, as I mentioned, none of us is immune to suicide if they cannot receive help. We all exist under circumstances. We have a lot of experiences in life. We live in rich or poor neighborhoods. There are lots of background factors that make us susceptible to suicide drivers. Professor O'Connor in the IMV model uses the word diathesis to mean biological factors, includes genetic and hereditary factors that make us more susceptible and easier to be affected by suicide. For example, if you're a carrier of a specific depressive disorder, it increases your risk for suicide. That's a biological factor. If it's an endogenous kind of form of depression, there are many other biological conditions that make us susceptible. The environment in which we live in, for example, a woman and a man who are living into an intimate partner violent relationship, that's an environment that increases the risk for suicidal behaviors within one of the two people. Refugees, who are individuals that survive in extremely festering protective environments, like refugee camps, settlements, and in conditions that really are inhumanly inhabitable. They are at high risk. Life events, exposure to traumatic events can make you feel life is not worth living. So the interaction of both the diathesis or the biological factors, the environment in which people survive, and life events increases the sustainability of suicidal behaviors and ideations within the general population. O'Connor actually uses the word trigger events. So any events you can have a diathesis, which are the biological factors that make you susceptible to suicide, but you can't act on them until when you are in an environment that resilience taxes you, that you are unable to cope with suicidal. You're unable to cope with those stressful difficulties. It takes life events to trigger your diathesis factors, which are your biological weaknesses or conditions that make you susceptible. And that doesn't end from there. Even if you are triggered, human beings normally have a tendency to move within the motivational phase. What motivates you to start to think about suicide? You are in an environment that is extremely demanding. You've been exposed to life events like rape, violence, bullying among young people. Now we have cyberbullying or social media cocaine. Everyone is on social media. People are exchanging negative information about each other. There's a lot of things going on in this life. There's family separation and breakdown. And currently we've seen, for example, during COVID, the social fabric of our society has broken down, which is changing a lot of dynamics in how people are connecting and seeking support from each other. So now the interaction of all these things motivates people to start to think about taking their own lives.
Excuse me,
Now that
Moses.
please, go ahead.
Just wanting to make sure, is the PowerPoint, have you activated the PowerPoint and are changing slides?
Yes, we are now on our screen. We have three boxes. I hope you see what you're seeing as well.
It is not what we
No.
are seeing.
Yeah.
That's strange. Is it what you're seeing now?
The first page.
We're still on the
Oh.
first page.
Oh, sorry. I'm thinking I send you the slides again. I don't know. Just a minute. Let me share again. Okay. Here we go. Sorry.
No worries.
What are you seeing now on your screen?
We're seeing a map.
Okay, excellent. So
But
that's the map that I was.
But we don't see the slide. We see I see the whole PowerPoint. I'm not sure it's
How is that?
sharing. Yeah,
Have you
because
clicked on the slideshow option?
Yep. Just a minute. Yeah, it's actually in slideshow now.
Okay, we are not seeing that.
Yeah.
I can send you the entire slide for you to share.
We can do that. In the meantime, you can maybe stay on the main page and go from slide to slide while we.
Okay, so
Sebastian, you'll be the one receiving it, I think. Maybe.
okay, so what do you see on your screen? Do you see?
We see the boxes, but they're not in the
Exactly.
slideshow format.
Yep.
We're on the slide number
Okay,
6.
so I've sent Sebastian the slides. Voila. Hmm. So you can see the box in slideshow, right?
We're not in the slideshow mode. It's like when you were trying to edit the PowerPoint. That's the screen we're seeing.
Okay, so maybe we have Sebastian share them from his side if you
Yeah,
have
let
received
me.
them. Mhm.
Okay.
Je trouve plus le bouton pour.
C'est tout en haut, à côté. Alors, quand tu
Voilà.
vois enregistrement automatique sur la même ligne, il y a le petit bouton play sur un écran, juste à côté du titre.
Ah oui, là, c'est censé partager, là.
Non,
Quelle
non,
partie?
là on a le même
Ah
truc
oui, oui.
qu'avec Moses. À côté, en haut à gauche de ton écran, et tu as le
Animation,
petit
là?
bout. Hmm, non,
Non.
alors soit tu vas sur diaporama directement, va sur diaporama
Ah ouais.
et
Et puis,
partir du début ou la slide actuelle.
voilà.
Voilà.
On était où?
Okay.
So we're there. So Moses, you can
There.
just tell Sebastian when to hit the next slide. Sorry
Okay,
for the
sounds
interruption.
good. No, it's fine. Well, so I was really talking about this defi understanding exactly the psychological dynamics of suicide, which means us to get to know exactly how does the person actually even end up thinking that suicide is the best option. How do we start? What conditions, circumstances, thought processes that take place within an individual to reaching the point of either dying or even stopping themselves from dying from suicide or enacting upon the suicidal ideations or thoughts. And as I mentioned, that it all starts with what you call the pre-motivation stage, which is the stage where an individual is not necessarily thinking about suicide, but a merger and interaction of both their biological makeup, their environment, and life events start to coin or to shape the way they are thinking about their own lives, the future, and the present. And it's the interaction of these three layers of life, the biological, their environment, and life events, that push them to start to ideate or think about suicide. I mentioned that what called all of us as human beings have what's called their thesis, which are biological weaknesses, they are biological factors, but these cannot be activated unless if we're in an environment that is resilience taxing, that is exposing. For example, talk about you being in war, talk about you being in an abusive relationship, talk about you being in extreme poverty, talk about you being in depriving circumstances, talk about you being exposed to, traumatizing things or events. So like all these things actually shape the starting point to think about taking their own lives. So the interaction of this pushes people to go to what we call the ideation phase, which is the thinking about suicide. Now, when people are in those environments, they feel they are defeated and humiliated. Defeat and humiliation is a concept that actually means, that speaks to the inability for people to cope with these demands of everyday life, of stressful circumstances or environments, of life events. People feel defeated. They feel humiliated. Imagine if you're a refugee, for example, you've been a person of status in your country of origin, and now you are in a refugee camp, or you are in Europe actually, or you are in Geneva, or you are in Belgium, or you are in Netherlands, mention those countries. And now you have to sleep in very terrible conditions, and you have to beg to be given human treatment. There's likelihood that you feel defeated with life. You can't cope with this anymore. Imagine you being in a love relationship, for example, where you feel you're disrespected, you're abused. You can't cope with those difficulties. It's human that a person will feel defeated to cope with those difficulties. Another which comes after that is always a sense of entrapment. So when people are experiencing those thoughts of feeling and humiliation, they feel entrapped. They want the circumstances they're living in are resilience taxing, they're humiliating, and they are defeating. They can't cope anymore. So the sense of feeling entrapped means they're unable to escape and deal with this. The option that always comes negative and automatically in their mind are called suicidal ideations. Maybe I'm better off dead than living. Maybe death can help me escape the humiliation and defeat experiencing. The process of from feeling defeated and humiliated to feeling entrapped, to start to think about suicide ideas or thoughts, or getting the thoughts in isolation. It works through an interaction of both what we call the threat to self or motivational motivators, or abilities such as problem solving, because if you can't solve the problem, you feel defeated and you want to escape. The thinking around an individual, all this, the moment you experience, the moment these motivators go down and you're unable to actually work around with them, you're feeling defeated, and then definitely you start to move to a sense of entrapment. And that process stimulates what we call a sense of feeling you have no focus for the future. You are burdened to the system. You feel life has no meaning. And that's how a person moves from thinking up, from feeling from just having a feeling to actually thinking that they should escape the state of entrapment. That's what's called the suicide entrapment stage. Another box you see on my screen is called the evolutionist phase. Evolution means dying from suicide. Here we're talking about behavior in action. This is when people act upon the thoughts, the ideations. They act upon the sense of defeat and humiliation. They act upon the desire to escape the pain and the inability to cope with difficulties. It's called this. Here, what we see is people start to act upon thoughts. And I remember you mentioned about the use of the word active and passive suicidal thoughts. They start to act upon passive, they move to active suicidal thoughts and start to act upon those thoughts. They start to get intense. They start to even they take action. They hang themselves. They swallow pills. They jump into trains. They jump off buildings. They blow their heads with guns, and all those many actions that you've had or behaviors you've had in your life or in your experience and environment. For evolution actually to take place, for suicide behaviors, for suicidal deaths to happen, we must have what we call evolutionary moderators. The evolutionary moderators are those moderators that facilitate the suicidal action. For example, if a young girl of 15 years was bullied at university or at school, he or she cannot act upon the death desire. But unless if they have moderators such as access to means and a sense of fear, a sense of lost fear for death, that's when they'll actually jump off the tree, jump off the building, or jump in a running tram or train and die from suicide. In other words, suicide does not happen once. It starts with the environment, it starts with our biological makeup, it starts with an exposure to very distressing, taxing, distressing and resilience taxing environments and life events that push us to think and feel we are defeated, to deal with life events. We are entrapped, we can't escape, we want our way out. And then we start to think that suicide is more ideal for us to survive and escape those difficulties. And as such, we end up finding evolution, which is death from suicide, as the most rational and ideal way of living or escaping such pain. You've heard about what we call rational suicide. It still comes back to the concept of people finding rational reasons to die from suicide. Not every suicide is actually built around irrationality. There are people who actually die from suicide based on rational reasons, especially those who feel like they're a burden to their caretakers, people with terminal illnesses, who feel they're entrapped and defeated for life. The same theory applies. When you have a chronic illness and you feel like you're a burden to your community and caretakers, people can always make decisions to really feel they're better off in a evolutionary stage or in death than living. That's the logical aspect of suicide that is sometimes criminalized in many countries. Can you move to the next slide?
Yeah, it doesn't move.
It's okay. Yeah.
Um,
Okay, now that we've learned about the psychological dynamics of suicide occurrence, what don't we know? What do we hear in our communities? There are many myths and facts around suicide. I'll go straight to the myths that are built around suicide, and I'll talk about the early warning signs of suicide in our population, at workplace, in our community and households. Sometimes people think that talking to or asking someone if they are having suicidal thoughts may trigger the act. This is a myth. We need to always ask friends, colleagues, if in the last couple of days they've been thinking about taking their own lives. When we ask about these questions, it helps us to link people to support services. It's not true that when we talk about suicide, it's going to cause someone to die or think about dying from suicide. It means we get to understand that the person is going through a psychological crisis that needs to be addressed through professional help. Another myth that we always hear is a person who talks about attempting suicide rarely follows through. Yes, this is very common in our community. People think that when a person talks about suicide or attempting to die from suicide, they won't do it because they're talking about it. This is a huge myth. It's not true. 2/3 talked about their intentions before attempting suicide. They are not crying. They are not just trying to dramatize themselves, but actually they're trying to communicate they are going through a psychological crisis and need help. So when you hear people passively or actively talking about taking their own lives, we need to take them serious. There is really nothing you can do to help someone who is truly suicidal. That's a myth. Whenever a person is going through suicidal crisis and is at imminent risk, they can be helped. There are various professional support systems around us that we can seek at both individual, group, and societal levels. So it's not true that when a person is suicidal, they cannot be helped. There's nothing we can do. There's always something that can be done to save a life. Suicide always occurs without any warning sign. No way. We always hear people say someone died from suicide abruptly. Oh, he was here, we didn't know. And he just died abruptly. That's not true, because for every suicide enactment, there are warning signs. These signs can be best understood if you really understood the psychological dynamics I've explained before, because people give us enough time, including when they assume they are motivational, pre-motivational, motivational, and then the final stages. So we get to see all these signs and just need to pay attention to these. There's always a typical profile for a person who may attempt suicide in terms of gender, education, social status. It's not true. Everyone is, as I mentioned at the start of my PowerPoint presentation, is susceptible to suicide. You don't have to be educated, illiterate, rich, poor, sick, healthy. Back to the theory I've just used to explain suicidal dynamics, we're all susceptible depending on the living conditions, circumstances, and their risk factors. So suicide can happen in anyone at any stage in life, if not helped or when they are within a specific condition. Let's speak about the facts. Asking at-risk individual if they are suicidal can help to lower anxiety, help them open up communication with you, and help them to link to support services. That's a fact. 2/3 talked about their intentions before attempting suicide. They are not crying just to get attention, but they are crying to seek for help. And this same fact actually speaks about the decriminalization, the need to decriminalize suicide. It's not criminal for people to attempt suicide. It's not criminal for people to call for help. It is only criminal that we cannot help them but criminalize the entire process. In many countries, including where I come from in Uganda and many other countries globally, suicide is criminal. If someone attempts suicide, the equivalent of the punishment is that to attempted murder. You can imagine, if a person is suicidal, they're in a psychological crisis, they need help, and the only way for us to help them is actually add more layers of distress by putting them in prison or punishing them. So that is really terrible and totally wrong. So most suicidal individuals, nearly 80%, plan their attempt in advance and give us clues. So suicide does not happen in vain. It doesn't happen behind curtains. As people go from the pre-motivational phase that I've just explained to pre-motivation to motivation, which is from passive, active to volition, or attempting to die from suicide, they give us a lot of clues that we must pay attention to, from speaking about suicide to changing in behaviors, to actually rationalizing the desire to take their own lives. All these clues actually enable us to know that someone is more susceptible and may desire to take their own life. Depression and suicide can affect anyone, regardless of your age, gender, ethnicity, economic status, and where you are, whether you are rich, poor. It's true that one of the myths is the thinking that every depressed person is dying from suicide. It's only a small percentage that is susceptible to suicide after getting an episode, a depressive episode. But it's also true that suicide can be a factor that plays part in stimulating or drive people to rationalize or think of taking their own lives, because it comes with a sense of defeat and humiliation and a desire of a feeling of feeling entrapped. So these are facts that are very important for us to understand as we try to unearth the topic of suicide globally. Let's think about, how about the early warning signs? How do we know that the person is actually suicidal or is susceptible at risk of suicide at any one point in life? Previous attempts. Individuals who have actually have had a previous suicide attempts are likely to actually do it again if they don't receive professional help. It's very important that if a colleague you know has attempted suicide, they are linked to continuous support until when they are really free from difficulties to cope with life circumstances. So previous suicidal attempt is a predicting factor to future suicide enactments. If a person suddenly starts to change in terms of behaviors, they seek to be in their own space, isolating themselves, and express feelings of loneliness. This sudden change in such behaviors and expressed emotions can tell us that the person is going through a psychological crisis and is feeling defeated, humiliated, and may desire to take their own life. So these clues or signs should be taken seriously if you are to help colleagues deal with suicidal thoughts. As I mentioned, suicide is a cry for help. Is a cry for help when people feel defeated and unable to cope with life circumstances. It's also true, one of the signs that I always recognize in my clients is when people frequently talk about death. They talk about death as an option, as a rational option, as a way of escaping difficulties. If people continuously use this language, most especially children and youth and older persons or individuals with terminal conditions, these are talking telltale signs that the person is defeated and is unable to cope with life circumstances. Please note, not all individuals talk about these things. Sometimes they may not utter anything, but change in behaviors can tell us that indeed someone is susceptible and thinking about taking their own lives. Increase also sudden use of substance abuse as a coping mechanism. We know that there's a strong correlation between impulsive substance use and suicidal ideation. There's an association between the two. When people overuse substances, they drive the irrational desire to take their own life. So substance abuse or use as a coping mechanism suddenly can actually trigger a person to give the person the courage and the rationality to take their own lives. Self-harm is different from suicide because self-harm is sometimes used as a coping mechanism in many people. It involves one using sharp objects, increasing the use of substances to achieve euphoria. Euphoria is a feeling of great excitement and happiness. But this sometimes people end up really, really dying from suicide accidentally. For example, a person may desire to do self-harm by cutting their veins, and as such, they end up dying from suicide. So self-harm can be a pathway to suicide evolution or to evolution in suicide, the evolution phase in suicide. So a sense of hopelessness, I mentioned using the IMV model that a sense of hopelessness is one of the elements that play part in the process of ideating about suicide. So when people feel they have no future, they are defeated, life has no meaning, and they are better off dead, we need to be able to understand that those concepts and words are not coming out of the blue, but are intentionally used, and people really desire to take their own lives. Well, imagine if you have a good friend of yours and suddenly he starts to give away their properties. Please note that this is not a very usual way of behaving, unless if it's rationally being done. Sometimes people who are suicidal want to give away everything because nothing makes sense to them anymore. Properties are given away of high value at no cost because they know they are going somewhere where they will not need those properties. Sometimes I hear patients telling me, I have nothing left for me for this world. I don't need shoes, I don't need cars. I'm giving them away. So such actually signs in a very distressed person can tell us that they are at the edge of life and need to be helped. Please help me move to the next slide. So after understanding and talking about the dynamics in suicide as a global phenomenon, the question is, what can we do? On my screen, I share a very basic framework. As a suicide researcher and a practitioner, I understand that suicide prevention and response is very important. But most importantly, is to understand that it doesn't stop at response. It stops at what we call the post-intervention stage. We have individuals who have attempted suicide and have survived. And we've just seen that one of the tail indicators of suicide or predictors of suicide is just attempt. So in my framework of response to suicide, I talk about actions through universal interventions, primary, secondary, and post-interventions. Universal, I mean, for example, if I'm working in an organization, I want to work with duty bearers and rights holders to implement interventions that focus on preventing determinants of suicide in the general population. For example, advocating for suicide decriminalization, which subsequently leads to health-seeking behaviors in hospitals and through professional help. We talk about policy reformation, talk about changing policies that speak about mental health. So all this actually will help us challenge the universal or conventional suicide determinants and drivers in the general population. That said, I think it's also very important to recognize that suicide does not happen necessarily with everyone. It happens with everyone is at risk, but not everyone is going to be suicidal. So what we do is, as I mentioned to you, I talked about what we call the at-risk populations. So universal interventions actually help us to prevent determinants of suicide within the general population. For example, the LGBTQ community. They are at risk because they live in communities and societies that actually punish them, that trap them, that creates an environment that doesn't protect them, that is depriving. So all these are at-risk populations. So we want to work with duty bearers to make sure that the circumstances that may make them susceptible to such to suicide are addressed. The most poor, the refugees, workplace colleagues. For example, I saw CoCreate Humanity is always advocating for good mental health for humanitarian workers. We should work with policymakers universally to engage and say we need to have policies around health-seeking behaviors in institutions, in NGOs. We need to work. I know CoCreate Humanity, for example, has been at the helm of working with humanitarian workers or people returning from field. So those are kind of at universal level, at policy level. This helps us to detect those ones who are susceptible and at risk for suicide. At primary level, we're talking about those interventions that target a specific group of people with specific interventions because they are at risk. And at post-intervention level, we're talking about people with lived experiences of suicide that may be helped in a special way, including their families and immediate relatives and friends. At individual level, the framework for response, we recognize back what the IMV model mentioned about the diagnosis factors. These are biological factors and personal history that make us or increase the likelihood of dying from suicide or thinking about suicide. So we need to promote access among, for example, at-risk groups and the general community, the behavior and the culture of seeking for expert help. We know at CoCreate Humanity, we are planning a lot of initiatives, including one that actually speaks about creating a hub of experts or peer support mechanisms we have. We have experts in those pools. So these kind of help those ones who are suicidal and have personal history, including exposure to trauma, PTSD, depression, to seek for help and get help from such pool of experts. Let's look at relationships. Suicides actually are more common at relationship level. A sense of disconnect from the entire system from the interpersonal systems or ecosystem of interaction among people is a predictor of suicidal behaviors. So we can work to examine the relationship that may increase the risk or otherwise. For example, people who feel isolated, humiliated, undermined, unwanted, at high risk. So we need to fix and work in a way that promotes good interpersonal relationship at both family, individual, and community level. For example, we know bullying is a relationship issue. We know that refugees who have no sense of belonging in specific countries or asylum is a relationship issue. So we need to fix those relationships because they are strong predictors of suicidal behaviors. At the entire community level, when we talk about community, we don't mean, let's say, the entire country. Communities are not homogeneous. We have a community of individuals who are returning from field, for example, among humanitarian workers. That's a community. We have a community of people with disabilities, a community of people who have non-conforming sexual orientations in many countries, a community of women and girls, a community of nations. A community is just a group of people that can be at risk, a community of young population. So we must work in a way, a community of fellow employees and employers, a community of humanitarian workers. So we must tailor our interventions to these specific communities and design interventions that speak to the needs of that specific community. At a broader societal level, we're talking about advocating and engaging governments and agencies to regulate actions that expose people, that promote access to means to suicide, including access to guns, including access to poisonous substances, access to other lethal means to suicides or volitions. So we must work with those duty bearers to make sure that those are regulated. When we talk about all these 5 layers I've mentioned, the 4 layers I've mentioned of the suicide response framework, we mean we must design and work in a way that actually prevents and promotes protective strategies while minimizing risk factors to suicide that I've mentioned. The risk factors include the things I've mentioned about at relationship level, individual level, community and societal levels. We must promote awareness campaigns similar to what CoCreate has done today to make sure that there's an understanding of the association of mental health issues and suicide within the general population. We must make sure that people have good information, and most importantly, there's decriminalization of suicide topics, and we must work in a way that stops the treatment of suicide as a sensitive and taboo topic in all circumstances and environments of the world where we exist and survive as human beings. Help me move to the next slide, Sebastian. I'm wondering if you have any questions that you want me to respond to, colleagues. Okay, so if there are no questions, allow me move to my last segment of this discussion, since we are keeping actually time. I think we have like 6 minutes left. I'm going to talk about what we call mental well-being. So all of us in the world and in a condition, society, family, and in our status, we actually strive for good mental health well-being. But mental health is not about being rich. It's not about having resources. It's about experiencing wellness. Wellness is experienced in 7 multidimensional elements, including at biological, material, emotional, at cognitive, cultural, spiritual, and social levels. We've just seen that suicide happens through an interaction of biological factors, at social interaction, at spiritual level, cultural, and at level of thinking, or what we call the cognitive level. But also, we saw that depression, which happens at emotional level, is a strong predictor for suicide. So emotional experiences of people must be good enough to support their well-being. So mental well-being or psychosocial well-being is an important experience that takes place at 7 multidimensional levels of life. Mental wellness is about us as a community, as individuals, striving to strike a balance between the different domains of wellness that have, if you see my screen, I'm talking about the well-being flower, which is an overlapping segmented flower with different dimensions of wellness. So it's about us having being able to enjoy life across the different domains. Biologically, we saw that the dietary factors are extremely at biological level, which means being exposed to being carriers of specific biological weaknesses. Material means people being able to access material support that can support resilience, building, and wellness. Social means people being able to have good relationships within their communities and having to deal or feeling like they can survive within their social settings. Spiritual, we're not talking about faith. We're not talking about going to church. We're talking about experiencing the higher power that makes you feel life has more to its meaning. I mean, spiritual is experienced differently. As I mentioned, that well-being is experiential. It's not about church, it's about what you feel that is higher than you, that gives you a purpose to life. Culture, we talk about those cultural values that are important to each one of us. And if we experience those, we are able to feel well in every circumstance we find ourselves in. Sebastian, can you help me move to the next slide, please? Now, well, that now you know what mental health well-being is about, how about if I introduce you to the continuum of mental health? Mental health starts with wellness. We all want to be well through experiencing what I've mentioned. In fact, all of us can actually achieve wellness, and all of us actually can move and experience what we call normal stress. So the continuum of mental health means every individual can susceptibly be able to move from being well to experiencing normal stress and challenges, to even moving into temporary distress. Some individuals are not so, some individuals actually can experience at severe levels the common mental disorders that make them more at risk for suicidal behaviors or to even ill health. We have people who can move from being well to experiencing normal stress, to experiencing temporary distress, to even expressing normal common mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, to experiencing severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, which is extreme severe mental illness, among others. So we talk about the continuum of mental health. That one thing I want you to understand is we're talking about mental health happening back and forth. We can all be well at one point in life, but we can all be severely mentally ill and may need support. So as an individual, at individual level, you need to recognize that mental health is something personal, and all of us must work, advocate for access to good mental health. Because today you can be well with a lot of money and resources, but that's not enough. You can move to normal stress. You can temporarily get distress because of work, exposure, life events, relationships, and you can actually be a carrier of a specific mental health condition. So there is no way we can live life without mental health. And we cannot say today I'm all well off. Today you can be well off, but tomorrow you can actually move to severe mental health if you don't receive support at an earlier stage in life. Seb, can you please move to the next slide, please? So let's talk about what we mentioned at the start of the presentation, coping mechanisms. We have both adaptive and maladaptive coping mechanisms. One thing for me to actually put caveat on is each individual is unique and distinct. We all experience wellness differently. We cope in a unique way. We have our own subjective coping mechanisms that happen at both primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. How we appraise our life experiences and circumstances determines if we are going to be able to adapt positively or to respond to stressful circumstances maladaptively. So the different ways every one of us responds to stress is very unique to ourselves, circumstances, and conditions, as well as life situations. So these circumstances actually that are unique to each one of us determine what coping mechanisms are we going to adapt. Are we going to respond adaptively? Are we going to respond maladaptively? Adaptively means are we going to engage positive coping mechanisms? Maladaptively means are we going to engage ourselves in destructive coping mechanisms? For example, Sab, you can move to the next slide. Positively, individuals may seek support, may try to actually intellectualize. I have a lot of information on your screen. For example, individuals who are unable to problem solve may think suicide is the best option. But those ones who can really problem solve by engaging in the understanding what could be the root cause of my problem, my crisis, and how can I seek support, they are positively engaging themselves in positive coping mechanisms or adaptive coping mechanisms, because that process of us cognitively intellectualizing and dealing with these difficulties helps us to develop positive coping abilities. As I mentioned, I've used the word primary and secondary appraisals, positive and negative appraisals. When you talk about positive appraisals, it means you, when you find yourself in a distressful circumstance, you try to reframe the stressful situation. You try to actually look at the positive side of the problem. You don't only focus on the negative situation. For example, if you lost a loved one today, you want to understand exactly, maybe death was an option in this situation. If the person had a very severe condition, you don't really descend only focus on the death process, but also what could be the positive outcome of death. Maybe the person had a chronic illness and now they are gone to a peaceful environment. So it's more of you positively praising the condition or the circumstance they were in. Always, you don't have to focus on the negative outcome of the situation. Losing a job as a predictor of suicide doesn't help when you only focus on losing a job. But how about if you say, I've lost a job, but this will help me focus on finding a new job. So positive reappraisal helps us to look at challenges as opportunities. Seeking social support. As I mentioned, that social well-being is very important, and we, as human beings, we exist in social systems. We interact within an ecological system and environment, so we interact with many systems around us. This means that we must find social settings and social connection within our communities. It can be people who we work with, it can be people who share the same religion, it can be people who actually speak to your values. This is very important because it gives you a sense of belonging. It gives a lot of diverse ways of coping with difficulties. It's a very important component. Mindfulness and relaxation, the psychological pressure that comes with life events can make us act irrational to the point that we think dying from society will be very rational. So taking a step back and engaging yourself in relaxation exercises and mindfulness has been researched to be very impactful on how people get relief and relax and deal with their difficulties. There are many ways to do this. There are professional trainers, but also you can do this at individual level. Sitting back, practice some yoga, listening to music with the right has that is less distressing can be really very important. Depression, one of the symptoms is inactivity, and inactivity really makes us feel trapped, unable to solve problems. We don't seek for support, we don't connect with each other, so we get stuck in our bubble of difficulties. So physical exercises can help us really, it's evidence-based that can help us really to stimulate our way of thinking and how health-seeking behaviors. So you need to exercise and engage yourself in those at personal level, individual level, or at group level. Let's move to the next slide. Now, pay attention to these things when people are distressed. They're called maladaptive coping strategies. They're maladaptive because actually they don't solve the problem, but they increase the extent to which you are susceptible to more distress, suicidal thoughts, and exposure to difficulties at a psychological level and emotional level. Sometimes we hear people when they are distressed, they avoid communication and talking about their difficulties. When you avoid talking through things, you maintain them psychologically, and they keep coming back to torment you. So avoidance is such a very common experience where people say, I don't want to talk about my pain. But not talking about that pain actually increases the extent to which you keep experiencing that pain. And you'll be defeated at one point, and indeed you can actually think of taking your own life. So talking through things is very helpful than avoiding them. Denial, people thinking, staying in disbelief. When you stay in disbelief, doesn't mean you are avoiding, you are solving the problem. You are not facing the challenge. You are not problem solving. You're actually maintaining the difficulties. Many humanitarian workers actually, as they're dealing with the exposure, end up in substance use or misuse. They drink a lot of beers. During my years of deep field experience for the 9, 8 years, I would see many humanitarian workers who have been exposed to secondary trauma using substances like alcohol in the name of coping with exposure. This gives you temporary relief, but not long-term well-being. So that's called a maladaptive coping mechanism. Venting aggression through frustration and anger. And sometimes people think if they direct their anger to innocent people, they are dealing with difficulties. This is not helpful. People need to really find support and healthy ways of talking through their difficulties without shifting focus through aggressive means. It's not about you self-blaming yourself to feel good and running away. For example, when you do humanitarian work, or when you've lost a loved one, or when you've been exposed, you feel like it's about you. It's not about you. Some things are beyond your control. Self-blame gives you a sense of responsibility, that you feel good, that you're able to take responsibility of the problem, but it's never about you. It's about a multiplicity of factors that have played a part in creating the distressing environment you are in. It's never about you. It's always about multiple factors that have maintained the problem you are dealing with. Thank you. And that has been my talk with you today about suicide and how we can cope with these difficult life circumstances. Unless if you really have some questions for me, I would say thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you so much for giving your time to engage with us through this very difficult topic at emotional, individual level, but also at global level. Over to you, Sebastian, for any questions, and happy to
Thank you,
respond.
Moses. Before to start with the question, I will stop the recording.